Apologize. So we're reading about Eliezer being dispatched to find a wife for Isaac and how he arrives in Abraham's hometown, Haran, and he makes a deal with, he prays to God. He said, God, help me find the right person. And he says, I'm going to ask a girl for water. And the girl who tells me, not only will I give you water, but I'm also going to give to your camels. I know that she is the one that you chose for Isaac. And last week we discussed the question of whether or not it is kosher to make that sign. Because we discussed Maimonides, who says that one of the prohibitions is to make superstitious signs. If something happens, that's a good sign. So I'll head out on the journey. If something else happens, then it's a bad sign. That's considered prohibited. That's considered idol worship. So Maimonides says that what Eliezer did may be problematic. Others say, how can you say that? It can't be. God, here it's in the Torah, and he's Abraham's servant. And basically, I think what we discussed last week is that Eliezer was very clever. Even though it looks like the story has been repeated in the Torah, it's not really being repeated. Because when Eliezer is speaking to Rebekah's family, telling her everything that happened again, he's really making subtle but significant changes. And essentially what he's telling them is every single thing I said would happen, happened. Because he's trying to sway them by showing that, look, it happened perfectly. And he's speaking to their superstitious culture. And that's what swayed them. That's not really what happened. Because a lot of things happened differently from what Eliezer said and what actually happened. Because Rebekah improved upon what Eliezer asked for. So from Eliezer's perspective, he was looking for a sign for kindness, and he's found a kind girl, so he followed the logic, wasn't following the superstition. So that's what we discussed last week, and that's what gave us a little bit of trying to understand why the Torah repeats this story, once when it happens and once when he tells it to the family. But there are other angles, so we're going to go back a little bit and read the story more carefully, because we just try to make that general point. So we went forward. So now we're going to take a step back. And the first question, a lot of questions to ask. The first question is what's wrong with the daughters of Kanan, the local daughters? That was his whole thing. This whole story is, he calls his servant and he says, on page 111, and he says, please to put, I will have you swear by Hashem, God of heaven and God of the earth, that you will not take a wife from my son, from my daughters of the Canaanites, from the daughters of the Canaanites among whom I dwell. Rather, to my land and to my kindred shall you go, and take a wife from my son for Isaac. One second, moladati. Okay, fine. So what's the problem? So why am I, just before you give the answer, what's the problem? Why am I saying this? Why is this why is this question surprising? Maybe God doesn't like the girls of Canaan. Maybe they're bad people. But what's strange here is God told Abraham, leave your parents' home, leave your birthplace, and go to Canaan. So that would have seemed to be that there's a problem with Canaan, and you have to leave, problem with Haran, his birthplace. You have to leave your birthplace, and you have to go to Canaan, go to the land of what will become the land of Israel. And yet the land of Israel turns out to be a place that God said, Abraham, and by the way, Isaac as well, say, oh no, we can't marry any of the girls because they're corrupt people. So if they're corrupt people, why does God want us to come here? In other words, from the fact that we started Lech Lecha, leave your birthplace and come to Canaan, I would imagine that Canaan is better. Here, when it comes to the marriage, it shifts, and we have to go back to the birthplace where God told us to leave. So what is the problem with the girls of Canaan? And why are those girls better and the girls of his birthplace? And if they are better, then why did God tell them to leave there? Right? We know that they were idol worshipers, and they tried to actually kill Abraham for preaching the oneness of God. So what's the dynamic here between these two cultures? Go ahead, Nia.
Yeah, I just want to add to your question.
Yeah.
I like your question. But why does God send, what's so special about the land of Israel before Abraham gets there?
Right.
I mean, why does he send him to that land?
Yeah, that's part of the question. In other words, if the people are so corrupt, why are we sending there? And in fact, if you look later in the book of Leviticus, we read it on Yom Kippur, God labels the people of Canaan or the culture of Canaan as an abomination. He says, God says, don't do like the corrupt actions of the people of Canaan and the people of Egypt. So Egypt and Canaan were like the most corrupt people. So I understand why you don't want to marry. So if that's the reason, that's why God doesn't want to marry. God doesn't want, or Abraham doesn't want his son to marry a Canaanite girl. And that pattern continues, by the way, like I mentioned, Isaac also, Rebecca and Isaac also send their son Jacob to go to their birthplace to marry somebody. So why does God tell him to come here? So that's the first thing we want to raise.
Even though Judah marries a local girl.
Judah marries a Canaanite. Yes. It says Judah go to Canaan. Yeah, it's not clear.
Maybe he wants them to us, whatever, to infiltrate and start changing.
But if you're going to infiltrate, maybe you should marry the Canaanite culture, the girls.
Right.
But God says, but
to teach them other ways.
right, but that's not what we do. Here Abraham says, I don't want you marrying the local girl. Go back to where I'm from. Go back to where God told me to leave from. By the way, Abraham tells Eliezer the servant, no matter what, you don't take my son back. Why not? What's so bad that Isaac will get on a plane or a camel, travel 800 miles, and go to Haran and go meet the girl? What's so terrible? Right? The Talmud says that the man has to pursue the woman. If you're in marriage, the man has to find the woman, not the other way around. So why can't Isaac go there? So there's two interpretations. One interpretation is Isaac is holy because he was the binding of Isaac. He was placed on the altar. He's considered holy, and because he's considered holy, even though his father and his son, in other words, Abraham and Jacob, both left Israel, but Isaac is not supposed to leave Israel because he's considered an offering. He was offered to God. That's one interpretation. But another interpretation is, how could Isaac go back to Haran if God said to Abraham, Lech Lecha, leave there? So yes, Abraham later went to Egypt, and that's a little problematic because they send Jacob back to Haran. But that's a generation later. But some people say for Abraham to send his own son back to Haran, that would be in violation at least of the spirit of the mitzvah of God telling him, leave your birthplace and come to Canaan. And now, when he finally gets to Canaan, it seems like the reverse. Now, we're not going to marry the local girl, even though Seth says it's actually good. It's actually probably a good idea, especially if you want to settle in the land. Marry a local girl, maybe the daughter of a tribe leader, and then you get permanence in the land, right? Maybe it's a good idea. But Abraham doesn't even consider that. So that's the question. The question is, why not? And why go back to Haran if we presume he left Haran because the people there were problematic? So it's hard to make sense of what's happening here. Go ahead, Steve.
Well, this may be a bit off the derrick, but
Are you saying we're talking about the path of going to? Yeah.
not knowing the population of Haran, it's possible that Abraham wanted him to marry somebody that was closer to their tribalism, because it may have been a fairly small populated place.
Right.
And in doing so, he would marry somebody that would share his yichus, if you will.
Right. So that's interesting. So you're saying that it's actually, this ties into another question. Part of the problem here is that, okay, so let me reiterate what you're saying. You're saying basically, with your permission, he ends up marrying someone from the family, right? He marries let's see exactly. Isaac marries his first cousin's son, his first cousin's daughter, first cousin once removed. So he ends up marrying from the family. And she happens to be kind, just like Abraham was kind, right? What do we know about Abraham? We know he fed the guests. So Rebecca is the same culture. So you're going to say, Abraham said, go to my family. I know my family, even though the culture of Haran may be bad. And that's why God said, leave Haran and come to Israel. But for marriage, go to my family. Okay, that is convincing. The problem, not the problem, I'm not disagreeing with that. The issue here is, and this becomes very interesting. Abraham does not tell Eliezer specifically to find a girl for my family. He doesn't say that. He says, if you look in verse 4 on page 111, he says, rather to my land and to my kindred. Now they write kindred. Kindred, I think, comes from the word relative, but that's not what it says. It says, artsi, my land, moladiti, birthplace. Now, why is this significant? Give me a second, Steve. Why is it significant? Because when Eliezer repeats the story to the family, remember I told you that it looks like the Torah is just repeating what happened. In reality, Eliezer is making up a whole new story. And that's part of the lesson here. Sometimes you have to change the story. But what does Eliezer tell the family when he finally gets to the family and he wants to convince them? He wants to tell a story that will persuade them to send their daughter hundreds of miles away, almost 1,000 miles away. What does he say? When he talks about that oath that Abraham tells him to take, he says it a little bit different. What does he say? So if you look, this is actually fascinating. Look at page 115, verse 38. You don't have to turn. You can trust me if you want. 37, page 115, verse 37. And my master had me take an oath saying, do not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites in whose land I dwell, unless is only, ki'im, imlo, unless you go to my father's house and to my family. Did Abraham say this? Look at verse 4. Put your finger on page 111, verse 4. And then look at 115, verse 38. Did Abraham say what Eliezer said? He said, absolutely not. He didn't say my father's house, and he did not say my family. So why is he making this stuff up? Because he wants to persuade the family, we were looking just for you. Imagine I come to town and I say, come to the family, I find a girl, and I come to the father and I say, well, I really came looking for anybody. Happens to be I saw your girl, so can I have your girl? No, you want to say, she's the one I came for. She's the one why I traveled the 800 miles for, right? And that's a little bit more persuasive. So that's what Eliezer says. But the difference between what Eliezer says and what Abraham says makes it a little bit difficult to say what Steve is saying, even though some commentators say it. Some commentators say when he says moladiti, my birthplace, he means my family. But others say no, there was no requirement to marry specifically from the family. So if you tell me the way you said it, and some people say that he means take from my family, you say Abraham knows the character of his family. But if you mean the broader town, then okay, if they're good people, so why did God tell him to leave? That ties into to Neil's question. Why did God tell him to leave? Especially why did God tell him to go to Kanan if the people there are so corrupt that we can't even marry a girl from there? So these are the issues at hand. Go ahead, Steve.
Well, sometimes you might go to a drugstore and buy a book of names.
Yeah.
Or you're in a restaurant and the pad has a maze.
Yes. Okay.
And to solve it, sometimes you start at the end and go
Right.
back.
Right.
So in this case, we know that Rebecca is specifically who we're talking about.
Yes.
So if we know that Rebecca is specifically who we are talking about, the daughters of Kanan and the women's birthplace, is irrelevant. Because when you solve the maze, sometimes you start at the very end and go back.
Yeah.
So Rebecca
is the goal.
Is the topic. Correct.
However, so we want to understand what forms Rebecca. What about her or her culture is desirable? And what about her culture is problematic? And therefore God said, leave that place. So yes, you're right. We know, if you want to know who to marry, we found Rebecca. But what is the Torah telling us about the broader cultures? And the reason why it's important is because you see the pattern continuing. because in the next generation, Rebecca herself also, she tells her husband literally these words, Katzti b'chayai, I'm disgusted in my life. I don't want to live if my son, Jacob, marries a Canaanite girl. So, and later on in the Torah, same thing. When God tells us don't act in a bad way, in an evil way, in the way of abomination, he says, do not act like the people of Canaan, which you're about to come in the book of Leviticus. So it's important to understand what is the problem of Canaan, because it's not just a one-time event. It's not just we have to find a wife for Isaac when we found Rebecca. That's true, but you see how the theme of the culture of Canaan keeps coming up in the Torah, even later when it comes to the laws. Let me just show you that if you want to look at the verses, or I'll read it to you, whatever you prefer. Let me see if I can find it. Like I said, we read it on Yom Kippur in the afternoon. I'm reading Leviticus chapter 18, page 649. You don't have to turn. I'm reading it to you. I'm going to try to be loyal to what it says. Here it goes. Hashem spoke to Moses saying, speak to the children of Israel and say to them, I am Hashem your God. Do not perform the practice of the land of Egypt in which you dwelled, and do not perform the practice of the land of Canaan to which I bring you. And do not follow their traditions. I was looking for something more sharp than that, but the bottom line here is that the Torah is equating those cultures. These are the terrible cultures that we don't want to learn from. Yeah, so there are other verses as well later on in that same reading. For example, he says, all these abominations, if you turn to page 655, verse 27, for the inhabitants of the land who are before you, in other words, the lands of Canaan, committed all these abominations, and the land became contaminated. Let not the land disgorge you for having contaminated it as it disgorged the nation that was before you. So it's like going to spit it out. And Rashi explains that Israel is sensitive. So therefore, if the people living there act in a way of abomination, ultimately they'll be spit out of the land of Israel. That's why the people of Canaan were spit out. And ultimately, God is saying we should not follow those cultures. But my point here is that when you want to say an example of a culture that you should not learn from, it's Egypt and Canaan. But again, Haran, Avram's birthplace, now in the story sounds like a wonderful place. But if it's so wonderful, why did God tell Abraham, pack your bags and leave? And also, we know that they persecuted Abraham, and that's why Abraham had to escape. Now, I just want to say one point before Neil speaks. There's a little bit of a question here of where exactly, what city we're talking about, what town we're talking about. There are two towns. There's Haran and Ur Kasdim. There's a little bit of a confusion here. In other words, amongst the sages, there's not the sages, the early commentators, there's different opinions. Some say that even though they have two names, they're very close to each other. So it's like Greenwich and Kaskab. So Abraham was born in Ur Kasdim, then went to Haran. Now he's saying, go back to Haran, and he's calling it my birthplace, but it's not really his birthplace because his birthplace is Haran, not Ur Kasdim. So what do you do with that information? So the more simple interpretation is that they're very close to each other. So even though Rashi says that Abraham tells Eliezer, go back to my birthplace, Rashi says Ur Kasdim, we know he never went to Ur Kasdim. We know he went to Haran. So what do you do with that? So it must be that they're very close to each other. That's one way to look at it. Another way to look at it, no, it's two separate places. And Abraham was born in Haran, then went to Ur Kasdim, then moved back to Haran. And now he's saying Haran happens to be the birthplace and the place he left from. I'm just trying to say that there's a little bit of confusion. So I'm just putting it out there because like I said, Rashi and Ramban disagree about this. Just putting it out there. Why am I saying it exactly now? I don't remember. Okay, go ahead, Neil.
So it's my understanding that when I read these sentences in the Torah, that finding Rebecca was a very positive thing.
Yes.
But I want to, because we've read the Torah many times, and the Torah says we differentiate between reading it 100 times and
101 times, yes.
So
let's question that assumption.
Let's go back and look at the tape from last year.
Yeah.
Isaac and Rebecca are not happily married later in their life.
Right. Right. Well,
and
okay.
let me finish.
Okay.
not only they're not happily married, as it says in the commentaries, and it seems from the Torah, but Rebecca tries to trick Isaac
Right.
at a very terrible moment in that situation.
Right, right.
And in hindsight, I can only imagine what Isaac thinks of his wife when he finds out the trick she played on him,
Right,
which I know I'm way ahead chapters ahead.
right. Very good. Okay.
But in hindsight, right? So
Yeah.
now that we know that she's, and also the Torah says over and over again that she's the sister of Lavan.
Yeah, and we know Lavan is a trickster because he tricks Jacob. He tricks Jacob to marry into the other daughter. Jacob wants the younger daughter. He gives him the older daughter. So you're saying maybe this actually was not the best deal. Maybe he should have married a Canaanite girl.
No, that's not him.
Right.
No, but- So the Torah says over and over again that she's the sister of Lavan, and we have a problem with that.
Yeah.
And it seems that the Torah has a problem with her because of that. But I think when I learned that later on,
Yeah.
right, it always pointed me back to this story and saying,
Maybe this was too good to be true. Okay, so let me just address a little bit here, just to touch upon a few points, which we're going to learn later. The relationship of the marriage between Rebecca and Isaac is very interesting because on one hand, you see clearly in the events that their communication is a little bit problematic, to say the least, as an understatement. On the other hand, it seems that they have a good relationship. It's the only place in the Torah, at least that I could remember in the 5 books of Moses, where it says that there was marriage and Isaac loved her, the end of this week's Parsha. So how do you square these two, right? A loving relationship, but the communication is problematic. There may be hints to that later on in the Parsha, in this Parsha, so we'll save that because I want you to come back. But it could be there's a culture difference. And I was just talking to my brother-in-law who was here for Shabbos, and he was asking, his kids are of marriageable age, and they were talking about, okay, so if you're looking for a spouse, do you want to marry someone from your culture, from your similar background, or do you just marry someone you like and they may be from a different culture? And it's nice to say, well, we look at the person, not the family, not the culture. But ultimately, if it's a completely different culture, maybe their expectations are different. And maybe that can cause a tremendous amount of strife. So what you're leading to is, I think what you're saying is that maybe even though Rebecca is a kind person, maybe in the culture, the way the culture communicates is different, right? Some cultures are abrupt and upfront. If you're an American and you go to Israel, after about a month, the first month it's nice. After about a month, after 6 months for sure, you can't stand the place because there's no basic manners. Everybody is just blunt and upfront and tells you, get out of my life, get out of my way. And it's just a very difficult, the only way, it's a pressure. I've lived in Israel for 4 years, had a great time, but you can't ignore that. That's a completely different culture. Now, Israelis come to the United States, they can't handle it. They say everybody's so polite and superficial, but it's a facade. They'll never tell you what they think about you, and they can't handle it. Okay. So all I'm trying to say is that, yes, you're going to marry someone from 800 kilometers away. There's going to be differences in how you communicate. And how an Israeli communicates. In America, you would say you're attacking me and you don't respect me and that will put me on the defensive. And if I'm an American and I don't communicate because I'm trying to be polite and I'm trying to be a little more subtle, they take it as dishonesty. Right. So I'm just bringing an example of, yes, there is a cost. Maybe you're right. Maybe it's the right shidduch. It's the right match and she's kind, but the culture difference actually will have an effect in how people live and how people communicate because our expectations of how subtlety. Rebecca was trying to, we'll get to the stories of the tricking the brothers. And I know Seth and me have a long history about this. So I already see, I don't want to say tension, but I see the passion emerging, which is wonderful. But what I'm trying to say here is, I think that Rebecca was trying to communicate as best as she could in a subtle way. And she's like, my husband is oblivious. He doesn't get the hint, right? And men and women are like that sometimes. The woman communicates. It's. I don't want to get unpolitically correct. No, what I mean to say is that sometimes a woman communicate in a subtle way, and the man is like, why didn't you tell me that? Oh, you've been thinking that for 6 months. Why don't you tell me? And she's like, I've been telling this to you all this time. You've just been ignoring it, right? All I'm trying to say is that your point is very well made, that it's very possible that the fact that they come from different cultures will affect, even though it was I think it was a loving marriage, will affect the breakdowns in communication. And part of the lesson is when you're going to marry someone from a different culture or from a different experience, you have to be cognizant of the fact that the way I communicate may not be the way she communicates. Right. So maybe this is all part of the thing. So we'll take Seth, then Steve, then Vicky. Go ahead. Yes.
I think when I read the Torah, the second or the 101st time,
Yes.
whatever it might be, that I read it and I say, maybe it was just a gigantic mistake that they chose for that.
Yeah. So maybe. So that begs the question of why did Abraham insist that we should go back? And like I said, even Rebecca, who, if she thought it was such a terrible idea, the shidduch, because it wasn't working in her communication, she again tells her son, go back to my birthplace. And she doesn't just say, I think is a better girl, nicer, more beautiful girl there. She says, Katzti b'chayai, I'm disgusted in my life. Basically, I want to end my life if my son marries a Canaanite girls. They were corrupt, the girls. That's what the Torah seems to be saying. So they all could be true. It could be that there's a certain cost to marry someone from a different culture, but you have to measure the alternatives. And by the way, if you want to talk about the trickery, it goes to the next generation, because Jacob goes to his family, Lavan's daughters, to marry, and he marries Rachel. He's tricked to marry Leah first, and Rachel ends up marrying the other two. And what does she do on the way out of Haran? She tricks her father, and she steals his gods. And then Jacob wouldn't occur to him that someone would steal someone else's gods. So he curses, and he says the person who stole it will die. And many people believe that's why Rachel died. Now, if Jacob would have known that there's a possibility that it may be Rachel, he would not say that. She loved her more than anyone else, right? Maybe he didn't occur to him that she would do that. Maybe that itself is part of the culture. She doesn't want her father to serve idols, so instead of confronting, she takes it. Right? That's a different way of communication, and you have to be cognizant. Not everybody communicates in the same way. Not every culture communicates in the same way. That causes problems. We're sitting here in 2022. We have the benefit of benefiting from this knowledge that good people communicate in different ways. Go ahead, Seth. Seth, Steve, Vicky.
Well, it says in the Torah, when you take a wife,
Yeah.
she's supposed to help you.
Yeah.
And sometimes, like my mother, her yard sites coming,
Yes.
she did not speak nicely to me.
Right.
But she helped me.
Right.
And I look at that, and I think that's really, I think she was helpful. She may not have communicated the right way.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And I think,
But the other thing I want to say is, for once in my life, as long as I've known, I agree with Steve's script, that the end is Rebecca.
yeah,
And we are supposed to, and Jewish people, we're around people all the time who are not like us. It says in the prayer,
yeah,
that. And so we are supposed to, and I think the whole thing is we're supposed to be strong in our way of being.
right.
Around all other people. And it makes you stronger when a person has to ignore
The culture.
somebody
So you're
who's
saying,
mean and
okay,
yucky and
okay, very good.
dishonest, and you be what you have to be.
Yes, Seth says the best preparation for the Jewish
I
people.
agree with this.
The Seth is saying, I like this point, a very good point. The best preparation for the Jewish people is to plant them in a hostile environment, spiritually hostile environment. Because what that does to you is that makes you a person who has to turn inward and say, I define for myself what my morals are, and I don't follow peer pressure, and I'm not swayed by the cultures.
Mm-hmm.
And if we survive 2-3, at this point, almost 4,000 years from Abraham, it's because we have within our collective DNA or culture, we have that quality of being able to be different. And you're saying that maybe, you're saying, where am I going to plant my family? Maybe the best place to plant your family is in a hostile environment, because that's brilliant. I didn't think of saying that, but that's absolutely brilliant. But I want to say one more thing for your first point. But I say how different cultures communicate. It's also true about intergenerational cultures, right? A lot of people say, oh, my parents didn't love me. And that's not the truth. It's the truth of the matter is that my parents did not express the love in the ways that I understood to be loving, right?
So
So that
later on, sometimes.
later on, you may or may not know, but I'm just saying, yes, my mother never told me she loved me. My mother maybe did, but people, it's a common thing I hear, especially in religious circles after the Holocaust. People did not know how to express emotion, right? So my grandmother loved me, so every time I came to her house, she gave me ice cream, right? I mean, I'm not talking about my grandmother. I'm just saying a common theme. So the question is, you have to understand that somebody else coming from a different culture and different life experience may be communicating in a different way. And you have to be open to be able to interpret what they're telling you. Go ahead, Steve.
Well, I have to strenuously disagree with the premise.
Go ahead.
I mean, it's true that cost cultures.
Yes.
But that also is beside the point. In the 1980s, I was on a bus, and the gentleman who was sitting next to me was an ethnic Iranian, and so we got to talking quite a bit. It was a long bus ride. And so we finally concluded that there's a greater diversity, greater standard, we're both mathematicians, so there's a greater standard deviation amongst individuals than there are amongst cultures. So, in that sense, I mean, Isaac had certainly one major traumatic experience in his life.
Yes.
And so we have to examine the two individuals to, to maybe give us a clue with respect to their relationship.
Correct. Look, first.
And I think culture is secondary, and it's the specific individuals involved that is primary.
Okay, so I don't disagree with you, but I think that your attitude toward the sort of the balance between the influence of the individual and the influence of the culture is a product of you living in the modern world, where people see themselves as primarily individuals. But I wonder if you would be riding a bus ride, a camel caravan from Haran to Kanan, and you sat next to an Iranian gentleman who was also a mathematician, and you had that same conversation 4,000 years ago in that culture, and you asked them, what is the greater influence on a person, their individual, what is the greater division between people? Is it the individuals or cultures? I wonder if you would reach the same conclusion. I don't know. I suspect you may. So I'm hedging here. I suspect you may not reach that same conclusion. I think that in the ancient world, people saw themselves primarily as part of a culture and only secondarily as an individual. That may have been different. But I'm not disagreeing with your premise. Yes, we want to look at Rebecca and we want to look at Isaac. However, what I do see here is a pattern, because I see it not only with Abraham, but also with the next generation. They're also saying, don't marry anyone from Canaan. And I see that in Leviticus, God's one, the example of the corrupt cultures are Egypt and Canaan. So then I say, okay, so what is about the Canaan? Canaan seems to be the culture you don't want to be like. And if Canaan seems to be the culture you don't want to be like, why is God telling us to go to Canaan? So Seth says, well, maybe that's the point. Maybe you want to grow the muscle of learning how to be not influenced by your surrounding, and that's why, and because our early ancestors had no choice but to develop that talent or that strength, inner strength, to be not influenced by the surroundings, but to live their own values. That's why we survived. Because if we caved into the pressure to be like the majority of the people, we would not be here sitting today. Instead, we would be doing something else at 10, 12 in the morning, right? If we're here, it's only because a long line of people in our history said we're not going to blend into the majority. So that's a beautiful interpretation. There's more to say, but that's beautiful. Let me say it here, Vicky, and then your next name. Vicky, go ahead, please.
Well, thank you. First of all, I want to congratulate everybody here on the call, I guess, except me, with the Father's Day. And your dedication to Torah study on this day is just. So
if you're a father, you have to show an example to your children.
Right.
So the best example, the best thing you can do for your children is show them the importance of learning Torah. So
right.
That's why we're here. That's why the fathers are here.
That's
a gift you can give to your kids.
Yeah. But the points I wanted to make in that conversation, and I had kind of a question from the very beginning. We don't take into account the reason why Hashem told Abraham to leave, because because now he's a different person, and his son is a different person, and he's a different person only because he left.
Right.
Because he left that environment, the idol worship environment, and was planted in a totally different culture where he, as Seth pointed out, became stronger.
Right.
So now we can imagine that he can separate himself from idol worship while maintaining that kindness of the culture that actually produced him. So
Right.
that culture produced Abraham. So
Right.
no wonder they wanted to go back looking for the same character traits.
Right. Okay. So let me say what Vicky's saying in other words, with your permission. We have two cultures. Haran are idol worshippers. They don't like Abraham's ideas of monotheism. Abraham's coming to shake the boat and teach about monotheism. They want to kill him. King tried to kill him. So that is Haran. But the character of the people, they are descendants of Shem, Noah's son, the righteous son. They are kind, they are hospitable. Even till today, Shem's descendants are hospitable. Arab cultures are hospitable. Come, they'll give you black coffee, they'll give you nargila. If you're infidel, they may you get into trouble, but putting that aside, they're very hospitable as a culture. So the character is kind. Their ideology, or their theology is problematic or corrupt. That's one. People of Kanan have a much more fundamental problem, right? Their problem is that their character is corrupt. They are drawn to negative things. A lot of the things that the Torah said in Leviticus that you shouldn't do, like the land of Canaan, is sexual immorality, okay? So their character is corrupt. Their ideology, they're not such ideologues. They don't care. The God, idols, Abraham says, I'll give you lunch if you praise God. They'll praise God, right? They're not so wedded to ideology. So now you have a question of what's worse. In other words, where do you go? Where do you go to spread your message? Where do you go to start with an idea with one person, and then eventually you're going to influence? I think a few billion people today consider themselves as spiritual heirs of Abraham. If you count the Christians and the Muslims and the Jews, well, the Jews are a small percentage, but if you take the Christians and the Muslims, I think you're talking about more than 3 billion people. So how do you take an idea of one person and you go to a place where and get it to spread to in that way? So first of all, you have to take Abraham out of Haran, because Haran, the people there are not open to new ideas. So you put him in Israel. Neil said, why Israel? So one of the theories is that it's the crossroads of civilizations. It's between Mesopotamia and Egypt. But the bottom line is, these are people that as long as you let them live their immoral lifestyle, they don't really care about what you preach, right? They don't really mind. There's free speech, there's freedom of religion. They don't really care what you are gonna preach, right? So Abraham, that's the place you wanna go. Now, you wanna build a family? That's not where you marry, because character traits is the most important thing for a family. And I think what we're saying here is, ultimately, it's easier to change someone's mind than to change their character, right? Their character, it's much harder to change. So you can't say, well, why don't you just find a Canaanite girl and make her a good person? Or why don't you take a good person and teach her about God, right? Which one's easier, right?
But you change the character eventually. The character, if you keep working it,
it's very hard to change yourself. If you marry somebody and say, well, the person's not such a nice person, but I'm going to change, they're going to change after marriage. Everybody will tell you that's a terrible idea. Look, Neil is laughing at me, right?
I didn't say that. You change their mind, they change
their mind. You could change. Mind you could change. You sign up to a university course and you can give them people new ideas, and you can convince them and show them a few PowerPoints, show them a few spreadsheets. You can change people's minds. That's not so hard. change people's character,
They
have to do it by themselves. That's correct. That's correct. So, but there's no expectation. You can't say, well, I'll marry you and then maybe I'll change your character. That is something that, that's probably a bad idea.
See the benefit, like you feel good if you're nice to somebody. You feel good if you're.
You're a little optimistic.
Oh, no, I know it's true. You feel good if you do something.
Could be.
Why
Okay.
don't you just adopt that?
Right. I hear what you're saying. I'm not disagreeing that. I'm not saying it's impossible, but I'm saying Abraham looking at his birthplace and then his current location in Canaan, what does he see? He sees Haran, there are nice people. They're completely invested in idol worship, but they're nice people. Here in Canaan, people are less concerned with ideas of faith. So they're not going to get offended. They're not going to try to kill you if you preach about the one God, but as their character is corrupt. In other words, their culture, their character is corrupt. So he says, I don't want my son. And Rebecca says, I don't want my son marrying these people. So why did God tell him to leave? Because Haran is no place to spread an idea, because it was like the Soviet Union. That's true. No, I got it. I accept that. I accept that. Go ahead.
So I think you're beginning to address my question. When in Abraham's day, can we say that there were two powerful worlds, the Babylonian world and the Egyptian world?
Yeah.
And there was no third or fourth powerful.
Was there an African? Maybe there was in Africa, but I don't think that.
From our paradigmatic point of view, there's only two.
Yes.
So
Israel's exactly across crossroads. Correct. And that's why you look at the kings, the battles. All the battles happen in Israel. The 4 kings against the 5 kings. Where do they clash? They clash in Israel. People are coming from as far as Mesopotamia, and they're fighting in Israel. What are you fighting in Israel? Everybody wants control. First of all, why are there 9 kings in Israel? Israel is the size of what? Israel is the size of New Jersey. Why are there 9 kings in New Jersey? So the point is, everybody wants real estate there. Everybody wants to control because that's the highway, and that's where the connection to the civilization. So it's a very valuable route. It's a very valuable route.
The other thing I want to challenge you on is you reacted 10 minutes ago to what Seth said. So you're arguing against marrying the local girl, but we got to address that Judah married the local girl.
Judah married a local girl. That may be part of his problem. The fact that Judah, it says he went away from his brothers. The trauma of Judah, the fact that he went and was involved in, at least was involved in the sale of Joseph. At least didn't stop the sale of Joseph. He was primarily involved in the sale of Joseph. So after they came back and they realized how devastated their father was, and their father was not being comforted, so the brothers basically dethroned him from his position of leadership.
Dethroned who?
Judah. Judah was considered leader of the brothers. So it says Judah went down from his brothers and went to found the Canaanite girl. So Rashi follows the Medrash and says that when it says that he went down, it doesn't just mean he moved geographically. It means he separated from his family because the brothers didn't want to have anything to do with him. So for a very long time, he was separated from his brothers for decades. And part of that descent, he went down and found the girl. It was not just geographical. Part of that descent is also a spiritual descent. And part of that may be marrying the Canaanite girl. Now, what's interesting is that ultimately, who helps them turn around and repent is the girl who was also a local girl. So we're not writing off the culture. We're not saying anyone from Canaan for sure is going to be. Of course, there are exceptions, and that's to Steve's point, that you should not look at the culture, look at the individual. And there are individuals who are not just redeemable, but actually redeem Judah, right? So there's no question about that. But you want to say as a generalization, and then more than now, you could make generalizations because the power of the culture on the individual was much greater. Even today, I would argue that it's great. But I think that even then it was even greater. That's what I think. I wasn't there, so I don't know for sure. Okay, we're having a wonderful discussion, but we're not making too much progress here. So I just want to conclude with one question. Not conclude, we have 12 minutes left. I want to raise a question here. And God, Abraham, you want to say something, Steve? Did you want to raise a point? Okay. Abraham calls his servant and he says like this. He says 2 things. First of all, my son should not marry a Canaanite girl, 1. Number 2, no matter what, even if the girl from my birthplace doesn't want to come here, don't take my son back there. That's the 2 criteria. The question becomes, what happens if the servant cannot fulfill any of both of those requirements. In other words, he does not find a girl that wants to pick up and move, a girl from his birthplace that wants to pick up and move almost 1,000 miles. And Isaac can't go there because his father doesn't want Isaac to go. So what happens then? So we'll look at the verses, but the verses are not clear. And therefore, there's a debate amongst the primary commentators, Rashi and Ramban. So if you look back at page 111, and this would tie in how terrible are the birds of Canaan. If the girl doesn't want to come, is marrying a local girl plan B? Right? So that ties into our discussion. That's why we're raising all of this. So he says as follows. If you look at page 111, he makes the oath and he says, verse 4, rather to my land and to my kindred shall you go and take a wife for my son for Isaac. The servant said to him, perhaps the woman shall not wish to follow me to this land. Shall I take your son back to the land from which you departed? Right? Let's say that the girl doesn't want to come. I found the best girl. She doesn't want to come. Should I take Isaac back? So Abraham answered him, beware not to return my son to there. Hashem, God of heaven, who took me from the house of my father and from the land of my birth, who spoke concerning me and who swore to me saying, to your offspring will I give this land. He will send his angel before you and you will take a wife for my son from there. What is verse 7 saying? Verse 7 is saying, don't worry. God is on our side. God will send the angel and God will help you. So Eliezer says, what happens if you take the oath is a serious business. Oath is a legal contract. You're making me promise something that may be a contradiction, not to marry a local girl, to marry a girl from Haran. But what happens if the girl from Haran doesn't want to come? I can't take Isaac there. What should I do? So Abraham says, don't worry. God will send his angel and everything is going to work out. I don't know. I have to check it up. I don't know. But let's continue. Verse 7 says, don't worry, God will solve it. But then you have verse 8. Verse 8 says, but if the woman will not wish to follow you, you shall then be absolved of this oath of mine. However, do not return my son to there. So you're absolved from the oath, because the oath is, what does the oath say? The oath says, find a girl from Haran. But he's also taking an oath not to take Isaac back. So what happens if you can't fulfill both? So Eliezer says, what happens if the girl doesn't want to come? Should I take Isaac back? He says, no, under no circumstances should you take Isaac back. Okay, so now what? So what's going to happen? So in verse 7, he says, don't worry, God will send an angel. God will send you help. So you don't have to worry about if it doesn't work out. It's going to work out. That's verse 7. But that's not enough. It's a legal contract, legal oath. What happens? What's the escape clause? How do you get out of this? So he says, don't worry. If it doesn't work, if the woman doesn't want to come, you are absolved from the oath. And then what? But you're absolved from the oath, but don't take my son. My son can't go back. So what do we do then? So here you have a debate between Rashi and Ramban, Nachmanides. Rashi says, what do you do? Rashi says, and then Rashi says, "V'nikita mishvua tizot," you'll be absolved from this, and take a woman from the daughters, and take a wife for Isaac from the daughters of Aner, Eshkol, and Mamre. Who are Aner, Eshkol, and Mamre? We read about them earlier. They are, I don't know if they're Canaanites, but they're Amorites. They're part of, when the Torah says Canaanites, it means all the late, Canaanite was the most important nation, but there were 7 nations there, certainly considered Canaanite women, Canaanite families, but these were Abraham's allies. Earlier, when Abraham went to battle with the 4 kings, it says that he had the allies, the families of Aner, Eshkol, and Mamre. These are people who were his allies in battle, and they followed him. They respected him. So there were some people of Canaan that were allied with Abraham. So Rashi says, if the girl doesn't want to come, you're absolved from the oath. Which oath? Absolved from the part. Do not take a wife from the local girls. And now you could marry, plan B is you marry the daughters of Aner, Eshkol, and Mamre, which are Canaanites. That's what Rashi says. Nachmanides says, no. There's no reason to assume that. He says, you're going to be absolved from the oath that I told you to go to Haran and find a wife. But no, under no circumstances did he permit Eliezer to go and and facilitate a marriage between Isaac and a Canaanite girl. So what should he do? So Nachmanides says, what do? You do nothing, then God will step in. In other words, from Nachmanides' perspective, it's a very interesting perspective. His perspective is that you, Eliezer, the human being, has a responsibility to do everything they can. But if I tried everything and it doesn't work, so then I have to assume that God will do it without my effort, right? So this is a balance. How much do I rely on God, and how much do I rely on my own action, my own taking initiative? So, according to Nachmanides, I think it's an interesting perspective. I'm not saying it's the only perspective, but Nachmanides says Abraham wants his son not to marry a girl from Canaan, to marry a girl from Haran, but he doesn't want Isaac going back. Maybe even it's by divine decree, because again, some people say that when he says, Shomer L'chapen, verse 7, when he says, verse 6, Abraham answered him, beware not to return. The words beware, verse 6, Shomer L'chapen, beware lest, right? Some people say that is the language that the Torah uses elsewhere about a commandment. Now, this is serious business. Beware lest you take my son back. So, and according to this interpretation, you can't go back. It's against the divine commandment because Hashem said, "Leave there."
Maybe he did that because he would tell the girl, "Listen, he's not coming back. So you either come."
So let's talk what Eliezer told the girl. We'll get to that in a second. You'll see that'll be
Because
interesting.
I wonder why Abraham told him not to take his son back. Maybe that's a silly.
No, so that's a very good question. Either because I told you there's two reasons. Either because Isaac was considered holy because he was raised on the altar at the binding of Isaac. So he's considered holy, so he doesn't want to leave. And that's what God, later on, you're going to see there's a story in the next parsha where there's a famine. And Isaac wants to do what his father did when there was a famine. What do you do when there's a famine? You go to where there's always grain. Where's there always grain? In Egypt. Why Egypt? Because Egypt is not susceptible to droughts. Not until Joseph, because it has the Nile. So even if it doesn't rain, it's got water. So Abraham, when there's a famine, Abraham goes to Egypt. So now Isaac knows what do you do when there's a famine? In our family, everyone does it, but we do it too. We go to Egypt. God says, no, you don't go to Egypt. You stay in this land. How come? So Rashi over there quotes the Medrash because God says, because he was raised as an offering on the altar, the binding of Isaac, he's considered holy. He doesn't go to the outside of Israel. So even though the other patriarchs do leave Israel, but not Isaac. That's one interpretation. Another interpretation is even more than that. Abraham feels that going back to Haran is going the opposite of the commandment to leave Haran. Okay, but what am I saying here? I'm saying here is Nachmanides is saying a very interesting thing. You have to do everything you can. But after that, you don't have to, after that, you can rely that Hashem will do it. If I know I did everything I can, I dispatched my servant to go to find a wife and sent all everything I could to persuade the child, the girl to come back. But then if I can't, God will step in. So that's the idea of how much do you rely. You don't rely on the miracle. You do everything you can. But ultimately, you know that if I did everything I can and it doesn't happen, then Nachmanides says, okay, so now it's God's turn. Rashi doesn't say that. Rashi says it's plan B.
That's what the Rebbe said.
Right. Rashi says it's plan B. And I think it could be, part of this question is, how bad are the Canaanite girls? Or are there exceptions within the Canaanite girls? Could be. I don't know. Now, because Seth raised this, I want to say this. Eliezer is very smart. We know he's not saying anything that really happened. Okay. So when he communicates to the family and he has to persuade them, what does he tell them about Abraham's instructions in the case of the girl not wanting to come? So let's see what he says. So we turn a few pages. Page 117, verse 49. Verse 49. And now, So he tells the family everything that happened and how his plan worked out and exactly what he said happened. It was all good and fine. And now, if you intend to do kindness and truth with my master, tell me. In other words, if you're going to let me take your daughter. And if not, tell me, and I will turn to the right or to the left. What does that mean? We'll get it in a second. Rashi says something very surprising. Rashi says, I'll turn to the children of Yishmael, Abraham's other son, or I'll turn to the children of Lot. This is sort of a compromise. Not Canaanite girls. At least part of the family is not Canaanite. Yishmael married a woman from Egypt. So I guess his descendants would be Canaanites. But Yishmael himself, son of Abraham, and Lot, nephew of Abraham, are technically, at least part of the family, are not Canaanite. They're Semites from Shem. So Rashi here is saying, Eliezer is saying right or left, because I have other options. What is Rashi saying? Rashi. So what is happening here? If you follow Rashi and you say that there was a plan B to marry someone else other than Haran, this makes perfect sense. But if you follow Nachmanides, who says that no, there's no plan B, we have to marry a girl from Haran, and this has to work. If that's the case, what is Eliezer saying? So Eliezer is saying, in a negotiation, never seem desperate. You're going to pay more, right? What's going to happen if they feel that Eliezer has no other choice? If Eliezer has no other choice, then they're going to start making obstacles, and they're going to start saying, well, we want more, we want a dowry, well, we want a deal, well, we want the kid to wait here for a year, as they try to do later. So Nachmanides would say that Eliezer is being clever. He is changing what Abraham said. Abraham did not mean that we have other options, but you don't tell somebody in a negotiation that this is the only piece of land I want, or the only person I want. I have no other options. If you have no other options, that weakens your position. So Eliezer is very smart. He comes and says, I have no problem. I'm giving you a once in a lifetime opportunity to marry into Abraham's family. You don't want, I'm out of here. I have other options. It doesn't necessarily mean he did have other options, right? So that's just Rashi and Ramban thinking about this story and thinking about what would happen if. We know, like Steve says, we know the end of the story. She married Rebecca, they lived happily ever after. The question becomes, what was the plan? What was Abraham's thinking if this wouldn't work out? And why is that important? Steve says, we were at the wedding. What are you going to sit and think about what would happen if? It's important because it tells us how much to make plan B. If I have my ideal, this is what I want. And do I plan for if it doesn't work? So I'll have to compromise my values. That seems to be what Rashi is saying. Nachmanides is saying, that's what Rashi is saying. Seems to me that what Ramban is saying, you don't compromise your values. You do everything you could, and if it doesn't work, the servant is absolved, but God is going to step in. Don't compromise your values because you think it's not working. But it doesn't mean you're just relying on the miracle. You are doing everything you can. So I think that the disagreement between Rashi and Ramban has ramifications, philosophical and theological ramifications about in general. Are you going to compromise your values as a plan B?
They knew he was Abraham.
Yeah.
And when he gave no option, it was like different than, maybe me giving no.
Well, when Eliezer spoke to the family, he did give an option. He made it like, we don't know if Abraham meant it, but when he bluffed, either he bluffed or he didn't bluff. But the reality is when he comes to them, he doesn't say I have no other options. That's a terrible place to be in any negotiation, right?
I don't know.
Yeah, you're going to pay more. You're going to pay more.
No, you won't.
Okay.
Well, okay. You'll have to do
If I come to you and I say, I want to buy your car, but I have no other car that's going to suit my needs. This is the only one I want.
Right.
Okay. So I'm going to pay more. If I say, look, there's 500 houses in Greenwich. I could buy yours, but I could buy your neighbors. I don't really care about yours. Or I say, for my needs, there's nothing else that fit my needs. What?
I'd say get out of my hair.
Okay, fine. Let's see. That's okay. I don't know if you should try that in a real estate negotiation, but okay. Okay. Yes, it's all good. It's all good. We have Rashi and Ramban. We have two options. But whatever the case is, it's clear that Eliezer is coming and saying, I have options. The only question is if he really does or he's bluffing. That's if you want to read Rashi or Ramban. What I don't understand, that's for now. Vicky, go ahead, please. I don't understand why Rashi says Yishmael and Lot. Why doesn't Rashi say Aner, Eshkol, and Mamre, which is what he said that Abraham told him to say? I have to think about that. Right in the beginning, Rashi interprets that Abraham tells Eliezer that if it doesn't work out, you're absolved from the oath. And what should you do? Marry the sons of his
He negotiates from a strong position.
Yeah.
And that's what he says, and Eliezer changed it.
Eliezer changed it. The question is, why did Eliezer change? Why couldn't Eliezer say? But even according to Rashi, why does Eliezer change and say Lot and Yishmael? I know why he says it. I know why he says it. Very good. I know. Because Lot tells them Abraham only wants his family. Remember, I talked about that. Abraham never said that. Abraham said my birthplace. But Lot comes and tells the story. Eliezer shows up as the story. It says Abraham wants his family. So now, on one hand, it's very good because you're telling the family, I don't want any girl, I want your girl. That's the one I came for, and that would make them sort of feel chosen, feel special, and want to get involved in this relationship. But on the other hand, so now, but he also wants to say, I have options. So what's your options? If Abraham just told you that you must marry someone from your family, so what are your options? Aner, Eshkol, and Mamre, Abraham's allies. So you're bluffing. He doesn't only want family. So now Eliezer bluffs and says, no, I have other options of family. I have Yishmael, I have Lot. Abraham didn't want him to marry Ishmael's children. Ishmael's children were from the daughters of Egypt. His wife was from Egypt. Lot's wife, you know what happened to Lot's wife? She's a pillar of salt. She doesn't want to share. She doesn't want to invite guests. So this was all a bluff. Okay. Even according to Rashi, he was bluffing. Go ahead, Vicky.
Well, I had a question about verse 5. So what if the girl doesn't want to go? So what parents think is kind of out of the question. So in that, Eliezer doesn't even raise that question. Is it because it's out of the question what parents think? Or because he will know how to approach the family to kind of persuade them, as you just said, that if not, we're going to have some other options. So
very good question. Go ahead.
Question is, what parents think, would they let her go or not, is out of the question, or he just knows how to address it later?
Very good question. I don't have the answer to your question. I'm going to let you draw your own conclusion. However, what I will tell you is as follows. Perhaps the most surprising verse in the entire 5 books of Moses, if you ask me, is what happens in this story. After they agree to the shidduch, they say, yes, this came from God. Remember, they're swayed by the superstition. They say, it must have happened from God. We agree. So Eliezer says, okay, we're going home. They say, what are you talking about? They say, you're going to say, you need 10 months or 12 months to prepare for the wedding. We're not sending away our girl right now. So Eliezer says, please don't get in my way. Hashem made my journey successful. Don't delay. So what do they say? Most surprising verse in all 5 books of Moses. What do they say? Let's call the girl and let's ask her for her opinion. Okay. Now you live in 2022. What's the big deal? But if you think about traditional culture, certainly 4,000 years ago, that the parents are going to decide based on what the girl wants, and they call her and they say, "You can go with this man." She says, "I'm going." So that's very surprising. By the way, the Talmud derives from here. Talmud says, Mikan, from here we learn that you're not allowed to marry a woman. You can't marry off a woman without her consent. Right here, there's a clear verse.
Laban and Bethuel answered and said, the matter sent from Shem.
Right.
We say to you neither good or bad.
Correct. But then when he said, I want to go tomorrow, can I have your girl tomorrow? They said, no, let's wait 10 days or a year. And then Eliezer says, please, no, I insist, please don't delay my journey. What do they say? If you look at after they eat, they talk about, so verse 56, right? Verse 55, page 119, her brother and mother said, let the maiden remain with us a year or 10 months. Then she will go. He, Eliezer, said to them, do not delay me now. And Hashem had made me my journey successful. Send me and I will go to my master. And they said, let us call the maiden and ask her decision, which is very surprising. Today it sounds normal, but back then, I mean, this is actually, if you put yourself in the shoes of that culture, it was unheard of. So I don't know the answer to your question. Do they think the girl's not going to want to go, or the parents are not going to want to go, or both? I don't know. I don't know the answer. But it's fascinating to see what happened in reality, that at the end of the day, you had both. You had the consent of the parents. I don't think she can go without the consent of her parents. That's why her brother and father have to agree. And her mother, actually, because some people say her father died in the interim, but that's another story. But clearly her brother and mother agree. So it's clear that they needed the consent of the mother, but of the parents, but that wasn't it. It didn't happen. Certainly didn't happen quickly until she agreed as well. So the short answer is, I don't know. I'm just giving you the facts and you can draw your own conclusion.
Thank you, Rabbi. Maybe he decided to take one step at a time.
Yeah.
And he want to bring that question right now, bring up the question, although it's a possibility.
Yeah, it's possible.
Even not only, even today, even like a few decades ago, still a possibility.
Yes. Yes.
Marrying and leaving the family is differently.
Right. Very good. Okay, I'm glad we had good discussion today. We didn't make much progress, but we did a lot of good discussion. Seth says we made a lot of progress, and thank you, Seth, for your very deep contributions today. Indeed, indeed. Okay. Yes.
What's the opposite of pro?
What's the opposite of pro? The opposite of pro is con. Yes.
What's the opposite of con?
Opposite of con. Very good. Very good. Very good. Okay. Wonderful day, everybody. We'll see you in good health, God willing.
Thank you.
Thank you.